The talk. All right, so what are we even doing here? One of the great things about grad school is that students get a lot of opportunities to give talks. You've got conferences, workshops, symposiums, meetups, and the expectation is for all of these things, one of you guys, a student, is going to go and present the work that you and your lab have done, potentially in front of a really big international audience. Now, hopefully, if your advisor or your lab is going to send you out to give one of these talks, they're also going to make you do a practice talk before you go. Practice talks are sort of a special kind of torture that we're going to talk about later, but they end up being a good torture, so sort of bear with me. The difficulty, though, is that the practice talk is really sort of only a drop in the bucket of preparation that needs to go into prepping a really great talk. So much so that if you don't organize this prep time intelligently, it's easy to do a lot of wheel spinning without really getting anywhere. And then you end up giving a terrible practice talk and only an okay real talk. And that's not what you want. Like, you want to get up there and crush it. Not just because you're like a narcissist like I am, but because giving an incredible talk really pays off. For one thing, it makes it much easier for you to talk about your work in casual situations. So if you can explain your work up on stage under the lights in front of the audience, you can explain your work to pretty much anyone. And that, plus the talk itself, is all good exposure. Like, you never know who's going to be in these audiences. You never know when a talk that you give at a conference is going to get you invited to give that same talk at a university that's going to be attended by recruiters who are going to invite you to do an interview and eventually hire you and make you happy, or if not happy, just like richer. So if that's not motivation enough, let's see if my clicker can get going here. Every time you give one of these talks, that's one more line in your CV making you look sort of fancy and experienced. And a talk entry in your CV takes just as much room as a publication, and you can give the same talk more than once. So that's just like free CV padding for nothing, just by sort of putting effort in once and then just reaping the benefits and laughing all the way to the bank. So the real challenge, though, with this prep process is that as students, even though you're sort of meant to go through this preparation process, you never sort of get sat down and walked through how to do it. You know, people will give you all these sort of one-off tips on how to practice your talk or how to prep your talk or what your talk should be like. And this is how people sort of get lost, and it all seems sort of overwhelming. So the goal of this talk is to break down this preparation process into a series of steps that seem more manageable and are at least sequential, and to give you at least the big picture of the main components that you're going to want in your talk in order to be successful. So before we dive into it, it's important to know what you're up against. It's important to know why giving a talk is hard in the first place, because a lot of this prep is going to be designed to sort of directly address that. And there are basically two things that are going to be working against you. The first is nerves. Like, nerves are just a normal part of giving a talk. I was really nervous sitting there. I'm still a little nervous. I'm feeling a little bit better. It's just like this thing that happens. Like, you're always going to be nervous. And it turns out that you can give a really great talk even when you're nervous. The problem with being nervous is that it makes it really hard to think clearly. And so a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today is to think about this prep process as just the process of doing all your thinking before your talk, so that when you're actually giving your talk, you're not doing any thinking. Like, the goal in your talk is that the only thought going on in your head is what's going to come out of your mouth next. Anything beyond that, you should try to push to the preparation process, because when you're up there and you're nervous, any extra thinking you're doing can cause some like pretty bad problems. The second thing that's sort of working against you is more or less the entire internet. You know, a lot of times people assume that just because, you know, there are people attending their talk and all the chairs are pointed at them, that they have to pay attention to you. But that's not true. You know, at any moment, someone can wonder about like unchecked emails or cat videos, and you've lost them entirely. So it's critical to be aware of this and not take it for granted, and design your preparation to try to be able to capture people's attention and hold it. So the other sort of theme of this preparation process is sort of trying to keep your talk below what I like to call the porn Rubicon. So you want to be able to hold your audience's attention enough so they don't start wondering about other things that they could be doing. All right. We're going to start breaking this down. This big chunk of prep is actually going to be two chunks of prep, separated by the practice talk. I think one of the first mistakes people make is they think of their practice talk as sort of the start of their prep. They sort of whip together a practice talk and hope that the feedback that they get from that will be enough to make a good actual talk. But in fact, a practice talk is really only useful when you give as good of a practice talk as you can and sort of leverage that feedback to move on. So we're going to start up here with a big chunk of prep that you should be working on before you're scheduled to do a practice talk. And we're going to break it down into 3 components. The first is coming up with the story of your talk. So this is the critical step that everyone misses, because doing this step sort of feels like doing nothing. You know, you're thinking in this step. It's a thought step. So the impulse is to go straight to start fiddling with your slides, but considering the story of your talk first, it not only makes for better talks, but it saves you time on the back end, both when you're doing your slides and when you're practicing your talk. And building your story is basically going to be 3 different steps. The first of these steps is deciding what the point of your talk is going to be. So this idea of a point can be a little abstract, so I like to think of it like this. Imagine someone comes to your talk, and they're walking home, and their buddy runs up behind them, and they're like, my alarm didn't go off, and I slept in, and I missed the talk. What was the talk about? That first person is going to turn around and say maybe 1 or 2 sentences about your talk. You want them to say the point of your talk. When you're designing a talk, you should think about this scenario and envision what you want that first person to say, and that's going to be the point of your talk. This whole scenario should be like your be-all, end-all, endgame. Like, burn this slide into your mind, because this means that people came to your talk, they understood the point of your talk, and they're telling other people about it. This is sort of exactly what you want to happen. So being able to see this scenario and fill in this blank is sort of the critical first step before you move on to anything else, because the second 2 steps of the story process are going to be figuring out how to drive that point home, how to have the people who came to your talk walk out with this point. The first part of that deals with making your point relatable to people. So obviously no one has any idea how the brain works, but the gist of it that we like to pretend is that you have all these pieces of information in your brain. They're all sort of connected to each other, and when you think about one piece of information, the related pieces get sort of thought about and remembered by proxy. So this is how you remember things. You either remember them directly or you remember them because they're related to other things you're thinking about. When you forget something, it means you sort of put something into this network that wasn't connected to anything, so it never really got lit up directly or by proxy. You don't want that to be your point. You want to make sure that when you deliver your point, it's connected to things that people already know about. So the second step of building out your story is deciding what those connectors are going to be. You've got your point that you're trying to get across, and you've got to think about who's going to be in your audience and why that point is going to be relevant to the people who are going to be in your audience. So, for example, I did my graduate work on querying electronic health records, and so I was giving talks to people in the medical domain and computer scientists. So, in the medical domain, you know, you can sort of say anything, you can get really deep into the medical jargon, but for computer scientists, that's a little bit too much. So, when I gave these talks for computer science audience, I would talk about sort of more relatable concepts that we were tracking, little things like doctor's visits, filling prescriptions, trying to deal with temporal data in Excel, which is basically impossible. Little things like this of just making sure that your point is going to be tied to real things that your audience understands is critical for making this happen. So you start with your point, figure out why it's relatable. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of other content that you need to actually sort of deliver your point and sort of describe how you got there. So the third step of your story process is taking all of this information and ironing it into sort of a fluid, linear narrative that is going to make sense to people. So while the first 2 steps were very sort of content-based, this last step of building your story is all about the connectors. And this should be sort of the most intellectually most challenging part of building a good talk, because a lot of times when you're giving a talk, it's because you wrote a paper, and so your paper should already have a point. You should have already made it somewhat relevant to your audience. But you can't just take a 10-page paper and try to condense it down into a 15-minute talk just by sort of ripping out information and smashing it back together and hoping that it's still going to be a coherent storyline. So this is sort of the hardest piece of the entire preparation process, because you not only sort of have to break away from potentially a paper that you put a lot of effort into, but it really helps to know what makes a good story in the first place. Now, the good news about that is that there are sort of stories everywhere, and all of these stories adhere to sort of a really small set of story structures that can be really helpful in understanding how these things get pieced together. So things like the 3-act structure, hero's journey, the 8-point story arc, almost every piece of mainstream media adheres to one of these storylines. So right now, I'm sure you're thinking like, I'm a scientist, I can't believe I'm going to talk about blockbuster movies, and that, like, what is it, Easy A was just on the screen. But there's value to this, I promise, because these movies, these sort of pop culture pieces of media, are sort of expressly designed to grab people's attention and hold it, which is exactly what you're trying to do. They're sort of perfectly put together to keep you along for the entire ride, where you're not going to be wondering about, you know, unchecked messages or cat porn or whatever it is that people look at the internet. So it's important to realize this, because not only have these story structures been sort of optimized, but even you guys and everyone else is sort of used to receiving stories in this format, like whether you're aware of it or not, because you consume them all the time without realizing it. So when you're able to deliver a talk that sort of adheres to one of these storylines, that has some notion of what makes a good story, your audience is sort of going to pay attention to you without realizing that they're doing it. It just sort of comes naturally. The other reason that understanding these story structures is important is because they have this sort of perfect fluidity between elements. Everything sort of stems nicely from the last thing and sets up the previous thing. Now, in an academic research talk, you're never going to be able, well, sometimes you can, but very rarely are you going to be able to do this flawlessly. A lot of times you're going to have sort of little breaks where things aren't connected as nicely. You can never get exactly that perfect story structure down. But you have to understand what those structures are in order to realize this, because when something like this happens, this is when you need to have slides in your talk that look like this, that tell your audience sort of where you are and how much of the talk is left, in this case a lot, so that your audience sort of has some sense of the progression and where they stand. The downside to slides like this is they take time away from your actual content. So these big story structures can be really helpful, because if you can literally adhere to one of these story structures, you can deliver a talk that's not only going to be entertaining, but that's going to be 100% content, that don't have to sort of take time out to explain structure to your audience. So this key step of having a linear narrative that's going to be fluid is sort of the big make or break step in terms of your talk actually being engaging and memorable. So just to give you sort of the Cliff Notes version of how you should be thinking about this, certainly a lot of times all these story structures, they start with a piece of relatable information and they set up the point early. So these are the two pieces that you should make sure you do so that your audience sort of knows where you're going. From there, you're on your own, like I can't do everything. But obviously, driving home your point at the end of the talk as well. So there's sort of three components of how to start your talk and end your talk, and then you're on your own for the middle. All right, so just to summarize your story, you need to have a point to your talk. You need to understand why your point sort of inherently should matter to the audience you're delivering it to. And then you need to take all of that and iron it into some sort of narrative that has a flow to it, that sort of captures your point holistically, not as just sort of a sum of the parts type of strategy. From there, you move on to step 2 of prep, which would be building your slide deck. So a lot of people start here. That's like the first thing they do when they're prepping a talk, is they build out their slide deck. But I promise you, when you have a story already sort of laid out in a format that sort of can be reduced to something like this, when you then go to build your slide deck, the translation between this and this is a really easy one. So when you put your time into building a cohesive story, building your slides feels more like a transcription of that story rather than sort of trying to do all of those things at once. And separating those steps makes each of them easier and faster. The bad news about your slides is that this is where the details can like really bog you down. This is where you get a lot of tips about what to do with your slides that can be really distracting. So you're not going to get out of a practice talk without someone telling you that your title slide needs to have logos for like Maryland in the lab. Yeah, like that's true. It's important that when you give a talk, people know where you came from. But it's not like someone's going to come out of your talk and be like, dude, like, no logos. So to do your slides well, it's important to make sure that your slides are actually contributing to your talk. You know, there are all these famous speakers and famous speakers across history, speeches across history. They didn't use PowerPoint. They didn't have slides. It's possible to give a great talk without any slides at all. So when you're using slides, you have to make sure that they're like adding value to your talk. And slides can sort of add value in 2 different ways, and so it's critical to understand what they are. The first is that they provide images. So even the best speaker on earth can't say a picture, and an image is often the sort of the most efficient way to get an idea across. It's going to save you time talking. It's going to be more memorable to your audience, and it also makes your slides sort of more recognizable to yourself. So I'm up here right now talking to you guys. I'm a little nervous. It's going okay though, I think. And all the time you'll see me glance up at my slides. I'm making sure that A, when I click this button, that the slide has actually changed, and B, sometimes I just lose my train of thought, and I look up at the slides to make sure to get my place back, to get my bearing back. That's really hard to do without images. So if you're sort of being lazy with your slide deck, it's really easy to grab a slide and throw in a text box that says something like this, develop linear narrative. But this slide looks exactly like this slide, which looks exactly like this slide, which looks, they all look the same is the point I think we all get now. This makes it really hard not only for your audience to pay attention, but it makes it hard for you. This means that if I turn and look at one of these slides during my talk to get my place, that to do that, I have to read my own slide to get my place back in my own talk. This is what I mean when I say, like, you don't want to be thinking during your actual talk. Like, that's thinking that you can just as easily do before your talk by finding graphical ways to represent ideas that you're trying to get across. So instead of sort of throwing up a slide that has a text description of what you're trying to say, coming up with a graphical representation is going to save you some talking time. So I can explain this much faster and much more sort of relatably than the text box. The slides are sort of more memorable to the audience. There's actually some cool studies on Harvard about making visualizations specifically, but slides memorable, and it's all image-based. And finally, it just makes the slides more distinct to me. If I look up at the slides, which I inevitably do like 100 times during a talk, I'm able to quickly know what slide I'm on. So the lesson with providing images is that you really need to make sure you nix as much text from your slides as humanly possible. Even when there's not an obvious graphical representation for the idea that you're trying to get across, there is no need to put text on your slides that you could just as easily say out loud. Your audience will read any text you put on your slides, and if you're talking while they're reading, then you're being annoying. We got that, right? That was annoying. Like, this is fine. This is okay. This is safe. I can tell you guys things without showing it to you in exact lockstep. So, again, slides provide images. That's what they do well. If you're putting text up there, it should be for a specific reason, not just to exactly mirror everything that you're going to be saying out loud. The second thing that slides do very well is that they provide rhythm to your talk. So when I'm up here talking for 15 minutes to anywhere close to an hour, my voice is sort of this static input. Like, it's hard to sort of chunk out pieces of my voice to understand. If you're just sort of loosely listening to me, it's hard to decide when I'm changing topics, when I'm moving from point to point. Slides can be really good at sort of reinforcing this rhythm to your audience, to keep them sort of on beat with you, to know when you're making progress through your talk, and they understand that things are moving forward. So this means that if you're going to make 3 different points over the course of your talk or course of the section of your talk, you want to have 3 different sort of visual transitions for your audience to sort of understand. Imagine someone's in your talk and you start talking about something that they already know about and they start losing their attention. They're not going to notice that you're talking about something else necessarily just by you doing it. It really helps, even out of their periphery, to see that something visual has changed up front. That lets them know that you're onto something new and maybe they should start paying attention. So having these visual transitions that sort of follow along with the logical transitions in your talk keeps your audience on beat with you. This is not accomplished when you do something like this, where you throw all 3 of these points on the screen at the same time. So now you have 3 different points you're trying to get through that you're talking through, but you combine them all into sort of one consistent visual input. This is how you lose people, and this isn't even your worst problem. The worst problem is that you're probably going to be up here talking about point A, and half your audience is going to be down here reading and thinking about point C. So not only is this sort of an elongated visual input, but it's going to be a super discombobulated one. This is how you cross the porn Rubicon. Like, this is when people start wondering if they have unchecked emails that might need their attention. This is how people leave your talk, and they're like, what's the talk about? And they're like, I don't know, I'm hungry. Like, it doesn't have to be this hard. Like, keeping their attention in the slides by showing, by stepping through things visually, it's just about effort. So the lesson here is providing rhythm, The outcome here is you have to strive to sort of show one thing at a time to the biggest extent possible. So instead of doing something like this where all these points come up at the same time, just step through them. It's not crazy. Little preview effect, everyone likes that. Again, this is just effort. This is you taking the effort up front to do these things, knowing that it's going to pay off in the end. And what's cool is that you can do this for a lot of different things that sometimes people don't think about. So charts, for example, are the perfect place where people sort of lose this idea. So when a chart goes up on the screen, everyone's been there to talk. Out comes the laser pointer. And they're like, let me explain this chart. And they're like, first I'm going to talk about the orange thing, then the purple thing, and then the blue thing, and then the red thing, and now the laser pointer sign. I don't think this has ever looked cute from the perspective of the audience. But more importantly, that's a lot of thinking. That means in the middle of my talk, where I'm already nervous, I have to do this modal transition from the clicker button to the laser pointer. I have to turn around away from the audience, line this up, and that's hard to do at some conferences, and then continue my talk while I do the laser pointing. Like, watch people do this. It always sort of goes not cutely. Again, this is thinking you can easily push to this preparation process so that you don't have to deal with this while you're actually up there and nervous and in front of an audience. So again, with these charts, you have all these PowerPoint little tips and tricks. I'm sure Prezi has the same thing, yes? No? Who knows? Is anyone a Prezi person? Prezi has similar things, right? So you have all these shapes that you can use in cute ways. So there's like the arrow option, so orange, purple, blue, red. Again, I'm a big fan of the preview option. So orange, purple, blue, red. By doing this, all you need to think about when you're up on stage is pressing this one little button. And that's about all you want to be doing. You're already going to be thinking a lot about what's coming out of your mouth. One button is enough. Like, just leave it at that. That's what you should be worried about. So by doing this, it means that your slides are doing all the work for you in the background, and you sort of prime them to do this up front. And you can just be up in the front, like crushing it. That's what you want in your talk. You want to be sort of the highlight and have your slides sort of supporting you. Now, I don't know quite like how to put this, but this can lead to a lot of slides. You know, there are sort of lo-fi ways to do this. Yes, PowerPoint has all sorts of animations and transitions that can get you going, but you can do this with just throwing slides at it. Like, I'm on 120 slides at this point in my talk. Whatever. Like, I hear a lot of people whining about slide count. Like, slide count gets you a lot of value for not much effort. So you should never be seriously worried about the number of slides in your deck, because whatever. All right, so just to sum up what your slides should be trying to accomplish, slides do two things to add value to the talk. They provide images and they provide rhythm. And to capitalize on those two things, you need to work on mixing as much text as possible and showing one thing at a time. This means that your slide deck is going to be bringing value to your talk in addition to you sort of presenting the material and speaking. Last step. Practice. Practicing these things sucks. It's so awful, but bear with me. Practicing is going to be three big components. The first of these is memorizing your slide deck. So far so good, not a big deal. The good news here is that if you come up with sort of a cohesive storyline, it's not only going to be more memorable to your audience, it's going to be more memorable to you. So memorizing your slide deck, when you have this cohesive storyline and you've expressly designed your slides to be able to click through one thing at a time, is easy. And all you do is you sit at your desk and you put your computer in presentation mode and you just click the button and make sure that when the new slide comes up that you knew that what change was going to happen. Simple. Done. Do it. The second thing is memorizing your first three sentences. So when you're giving a talk, you're on stage, you're usually the most nervous right before you start talking, because it's like, it's too late to run or like pretend you're sick, and like anything that you thought might go wrong in your talk could still go wrong. So like, this is the bad time. I want to highlight this because it will happen to you. Like it happens to me every time I give a talk. Like right before your talk, you're dying, and your heart's like, having your first three sentences memorized is the only way to get through this. It gives you the ability to speak when you're sort of paralyzed in fear. You have this like muscle memory snippet that you can sort of let tumble out of your mouth while the rest of your nerves settle down before you actually start thinking about what you have to say. Again, so easy, And just do it. It just makes a huge amount of difference, especially for like your first couple talks, because the nerves, they'll get you. And either way, both of these steps are way more fun than the last step, which is doing out loud, complete run-throughs of your talk. I stand by what I said earlier, which is that coming up with a linear narrative to your talk and having that be cohesive and fluid and entertaining, that's the biggest intellectual challenge of giving a talk. But doing these run-throughs, these practice run-throughs, is by far the most sort of emotionally difficult. Even when you've done everything perfectly, you've come up with this great storyline, you've perfectly crafted your slide deck, your first run-through will be a total disaster. I gotta say, your second run-through will also probably be a total disaster. I did a run-through of this talk. Oh God, I just broke my clicker. I did a run-through of this talk on, I think, a week ago on Tuesday was my first run-through. I've given this talk before, and it was a total disaster. I think the hardest emotional challenge of giving these talks is to take those first couple run-throughs just like directly into the face and willing yourself to go on. What you should not do is assume that because these first couple run-throughs are bad, that things aren't going well. A lot of times what people will do is they'll do their first 2 run-throughs, they'll be disastrous, and then they'll go ahead and do 8 more run-throughs. When this happens, usually that person kills themselves the next day, then they don't have to give their talk at all, they're dead. Again, we don't know how the brain works, but it does this magical thing with talks where if you do a couple run-throughs on your first day and come back to it the next day, it's like magically better. Like sleeping on these practice repetitions makes this bizarre but enormous difference. So couple reps day 1, couple reps day 2, few more reps day 3, you will be shocked at how much better your talk is on day 3 with sort of not much additional effort. Just sort of willing yourself through these run-throughs and not letting yourself get sort of hung up on when they don't go well makes all the difference. If you're doing the math, though, on this slide, hopefully you've noticed that in terms of the timeline leading up to your talk, this means you have to be ready to practice your talk 3 days before your talk, at least 3 days. Ideally a week, but you can't do everything. So with things like building out your story, putting together your slide deck, those are aspects of your talk that you can really like throw consecutive hours at and continue to make progress. But practicing your talk is not like that. You need this rest between repetitions. And so this is the only deadline you have to hit in this entire prep process, is making sure that at least 3 days before your talk, or in this case your practice talk, that you're ready to do these repetitions. Just to sort of stress out the individual components of them, because a lot of times people somehow miss that. The first part of this is that they're out loud. I just want to make sure that that's clear. A lot of people like to go through their slide deck and just say what they're going to say in their head, and that's fine, but it's not, because A, that doesn't help, your talk doesn't get any better from doing that. That's not, you can do those all day and they all sound fine in your head, and I guarantee you, if you do an out loud run through after that, it'll be a disaster. So they have to be out loud. Doing it in your head is just a total throwaway of time that you could be watching cat videos. The second part of this is that the run-throughs need to be complete, so from start to finish of your talk. So what tends to happen, and I've done this more times than I would like to admit, is you're doing a run-through, you're stepping through your talk, and you get about a third of the way through, and you're just like, oh God, like it's a disaster. It's unsalvageable. I'm starting over. I want to get a clean run-through. Once you realize this, you can actually see people who have done this, because the first third of their talk will be incredible. And then it just all sort of falls apart because they've practiced the first part of their talk like 50 times, and have only practiced the second half of their talk, maybe 3 or 4 times. So the second critical component of these run-throughs is that they are complete. Like when you're doing one of these run-throughs, when you get to here and sort of feel like all is lost, just like they don't have to be timed run-throughs, they don't have to be fast run-throughs, just like go chill, have a cup of coffee, and then come back, but then keep moving forward through your talk. If you get stuck again, listen to your tunes, take another break, but again, keep moving forward. Getting sort of consistent coverage over practicing your entire talk makes the whole talk good instead of just a component of it. Instead of sort of wasting time doing reps over one section of your talk and wondering why they're not getting better, it's because you're not resting and you're not doing the rest of the talk, and then you'll come back the next day and you'll crush that first part, and then the next part will be a disaster. Just do the whole thing at once, even if it's sort of troubling how bad the first couple reps are. All right, so again, practicing, you have to hit it about 3 days before you're actually going to give either your talk or your practice talk. Memorize your slide deck and your first 3 sentences, and then just like whatever it takes to get through these reps. Like find your coping mechanism and just do it. It's going to be brutal. Sorry, it just is. But that means that you're ready to do your practice talk. So I come from the HCIL lab, so maybe some of the other labs here are different, but the way things go over there, these practice talks go something like this. You get up in front of all your buddies and you give your practice talk, and you've gone through this preparation process, and your practice talk is never perfect, but you get through it, and either way you feel good that you've gotten through it and you feel pretty happy with yourself. Then it's just like your parade gets so rained on, it's not even funny. People come up with vast numbers of things that were wrong with your talk, to the point where you're like, you have to wonder whether anything you did was of value in your entire talk. But you did have a valuable talk. And I will say, it actually helps to know this is coming, and I think it helps to see it happen to someone else, because when it happens to you, like the feedback sounds much more critical. And so hearing someone else go through this process and sort of listening to what feedback they're getting, it makes you more ready to receive it yourself. So this feedback's coming, and you sort of just have to stand there and take it, and just go to your happy place and sort of deal with the feedback after you're not standing in front of people, I think is a nice way to think about it. But basically you're going to want to take all these pieces of feedback you get, and when you go back to sort of reevaluate things, you're going to want to classify them against these same parts of your preparation process. So you want to look at each piece of feedback and say, is this feedback saying that there was a problem with my story, was it a problem with my slides, or was it a problem with my execution? And that's important because this second chunk of prep, you're just going to be going through this exact same process where you're going to fix issues with your story and improve your story. You're going to fix issues with your slides, and then you're going to do your practicing all over again. And you never know when one of these comments you get about your story is actually going to sort of make 3 comments about your slides irrelevant. So again, the easy thing to do after a practice talk is start by fixing a couple little things in your slides that people pointed out. But that feels productive, but in the end, you're probably just wasting time, because a lot of times there are elements of your story that need to be straightened out that have dramatic effects on your slides anyway. And so going through the same sort of sequence of steps makes this process more productive. You do sometimes have to think about what these pieces of feedback actually mean. So a lot of times you'll get the piece of feedback to slow down, that you talk too fast, you need to slow it on down. So if you gave your talk, if you're slated to give a 15-minute talk and you gave it in 10 minutes and people are telling you that it was too fast, that's a problem with your execution. That's really only a problem with your practicing. Just go back and practice doing it slower. But if you're slated to give a 15-minute talk and you gave your practice talk in 15 minutes and people are telling you to slow down, then you've got a bigger problem. That means something's wrong with your story. That means you tried to cram in too many elements. So you really sort of have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what you can take out and how you can piece things back together to make it cohesive. The last thing I'm going to say about this feedback is that you don't have to use all of it. It's your talk. You can decide what feedback is going to be important and what feedback you feel comfortable with, and go from there. This is a good time to start remembering your sort of end game scenario and to think, is this a piece of feedback that's going to jeopardize this scenario? You get a lot of really academic feedback in these practice talks of people you should have mentioned or cited, or details you may have skipped, but a lot of those details you probably cut out of your paper for time purposes. So when you get this feedback, they're basically going to give you feedback that says, your talk should be 3 times longer than it actually is. So it's your job to decide what stays and what goes in the end. So thinking it from this perspective, and just thinking about, it's okay if your audience is thinking about your point. You just want to make sure they're not thinking about what your point was. So if people are saying things about your talk where they clearly got the point of your talk and they're sort of extrapolating from it, you don't necessarily have to implement all those pieces of feedback. All right, back to our structure slide. This last chunk of prep should be no surprise. You're just going to go through all 3 of these steps again and clean up issues with your story, then your slides, and then go through your practicing again. So story again, point, figure out what's relevant, linear narrative. slides, mixing the text, making sure one thing at a time is coming on the screen, and practicing, memorizing, and doing these run-throughs. Same 3 steps as before. That means that you're ready to do your actual talk. And I promise you that stepping through these big components, it not only makes your talk better, but it makes you more confident about giving your talk, because these are sort of the 3 main elements that you need to have, and knowing that you have sort of the big tenet components of your talk is nice. Once you have these things, that's when you can start sort of worrying about all these details and worrying about sort of little aspects of the sort of performance aspect of your talk that you might want to do. Like, for example, I like to pace around and gesticulate wildly, but that's not something I would seriously tell people to do, A, because it doesn't work on some people, and B, because it's not important at the end of the day. It's not critical. So you sort of get to be the one to decide, once you have these big components in place, how you sort of want to personalize your talking style, what you feel more comfortable with, and then asking other people who give a lot of talks what some of their tips are. That's how you sort of fill in the space around this. So again, these are the pieces you need. That was the talk, and I'm done talking.